All right, the recording is on. So good evening again, everyone. My name is Leon, and I will just be here talking for the first 3 minutes, facilitating getting this thing started. And then we'll transfer to Gurpreet, who is our guest speaker for today's event. He will be introducing us some topics and knowledges in the fraud detection work. So let me start by presenting my screen. All right, can everyone see it? So we're 12 Coffee. We do like these virtual conversation sessions with different industry leaders every 2 weeks so far. We have hosted around like 5-6 events, and tonight we have the honor to invite Gurpreet to talk about like fraud analytics and like some insights that he discovered through like his career at TD Banking. So I believe everyone has seen this poster. So a little bit of background and context here. Gurpreet, he is currently a manager at TD Banking. Previously, he worked at Bell for a couple years, and then he was also a portfolio manager at Queen's University. And I think prior to that, he was also doing a couple jobs here and there, like managing assets, like figure out like investment options. I'm super curious to learn everything related to that as well. And for tonight, if you have any questions through the Slack session, if you have any questions that you want Gurpreet to answer, please go to Slido, the website URL. So you can just post in the chat box. So and then you can either use the hashtag or the URL directly. Go there, and then you can basically ask questions if you want, or you can upload others' questions if you want those questions to get answered. We'll try to go through as many questions as possible for tonight. So we're just like we'll just like do the order based on how many times they get uploaded. So if you have any questions, don't forget to ask there. And also we want to take a moment to thank our collaborators. So we cannot make these events happen without them. They're listed here. We just want to do a shout out to Centennial College Career Services. They have helped us a lot on promoting these events. Also, we have a new collaborator from UBC, finally from the West Coast, where I am originally from. So now we have like a more audience and from the West Coast in BC and Alberta. So now, yeah, as promised, I will just like spend three minutes of everyone's time. I will transfer the floor to Gurpreet, and Gurpreet, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Leon. Appreciate it. Let me just see if I can quickly share my screen here.
Sure.
Give it a second attempt. Leon, I think you have to stop sharing before I can share it.
Okay, yeah.
Let's see. All right, guys. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. So thank you, guys. First of all, I just want to thank the team to invite me and give me a chance to talk, share some of the experience that I've had over the last couple of years in TD. Fraud is a very interesting industry, and ever evolving, and there's a lot to learn. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking to everyone, hopefully. Just want to give a quick introduction about myself. I've been in Canada for about 6 years. I did my MBA from Queen's University, and then moved on with a career in corporate finance in Bell, as Leon pointed it out. Spent a couple of years there. I'm through and through a finance guy. Well, I kind of was, we can say that. And then really got interested in the analytics space. So I moved into fraud, which I thought was a great opportunity and a bit of a calculated risk because I had no idea what fraud was. But in the hindsight, I think it was a great decision. So that's in a nutshell, just in the interest of time, what I've done and where I come from. I want to keep this discussion short and sweet for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I want to segregate it into two parts. So I'll speak a little bit about what fraud management is, specifically from a banking or a financial industry standpoint. We'll get into the specifics of what the fraud value chain or a life cycle looks like, and where do we come in as a support to the bank and the business overall. And then I'll get into a little bit about the career opportunities and the skill sets that you would need to find success in the space. So with that, let's move on to our first topic, which I need to get to. Okay, there you go. So I felt like before we even get into the specifics, it was important to talk a little bit about the lay of the land, where fraud sits in a bank, and simply because when we talk about a bank or a financial institution, there are so many different risks that we manage that it can become a little bit convoluted to really understand what fraud is and what we do, what are the areas that we support. So let's start there. So the first thing I thought was reasonable to talk about was, well, what are the different kind of risks that a bank manages actively and proactively rather. So as you could see on the screen, you have credit risk, operating risk, liquidity, reputation, market, business. These are some of the key risks. Now, I don't want to go into the definitions to bore you guys, but where we sit, where fraud rather sits in terms of buckets, if you want to segregate these risks for a bank, we sit in the operating risk buckets. And why is that? Simply because if you look at what operating risk is a risk that a bank faces when it's not able to do its day-to-day activities, right? Fundamentally, that's what operation means. Now, why is that? Why is fraud an operating risk? Simply because now when you look at, for example, a bank giving out mortgages, let's say, that's one of the core revenue drivers for the bank, right? So if there is a fraud, rather a mortgage fraud, that directly is a hit to the fundamental revenue source for the bank, which is the reason why we are categorized as an operating risk arm for the bank. Well, then it begs a question of, well, what are the different kinds of fraud in a bank? Because there are different teams that manage these different types of fraud. So the three key frauds are your accounting fraud, insider fraud, and financial fraud. So very quickly, an accounting fraud, as most of you might know, is basically when a company or an organization falsifies its financial statements, right? With perhaps an objective to look good in front of its, stakeholders or inflate its stock price or things like that. Insider fraud is basically at a very high level. When somebody from inside an organization tries to, for example, gain access to information that he or she isn't necessarily allowed to gain a benefit, gain an undue advantage. And then the last one and the most important one, and this is where we come in, is the financial fraud. Now, what I mean by financial fraud is, now there are a few different types. Three major ones are listed up here, and I'll really quickly go through what they mean. Card fraud is essentially the most conventional. You would just simply imagine it by, let's say, you lose a card that you own, somebody takes it, swipes it, you notice a transaction on your statements that you don't recognize, you contact the bank, and you get your money back. That's essentially what a card fraud is. Now, there are different kinds of card fraud, which I don't think it's necessary to actually get into, but at a high level, that's the definition of it. Then there is impersonation fraud. Now, this is basically, as the word suggests, somebody impersonating you. So how do they do it? Multiple ways. Either they can buy your data on the deep net. They can perhaps steal your data online. And what they can do is they can take that information and try to impersonate you either online or go to the bank and say, that's me, but that's not the customer, and try to get the money out of your bank or move it from one account to the other. That's impersonation. Skimming and counterfeit essentially means when you are, let's say you go to a merchant or a shop and you swipe your card. Now, if there is an intention on the merchant side to fraud you, that device might contain or might have the ability to take all the data which is contained in the magnetic strip. Now, what they might do is take all that information and create fake cards. And using those fake cards, they can go and make transactions either online, take the money out of the ATM. The possibilities are endless. So that's what I mean by skimming. Now, again, most of these fraud types you can then categorize as first party or third party fraud. Now, what do I mean by first party and third party? First party means you as a customer are defrauding the bank, but you're saying that that's not you. So there are plenty of examples like that. It happens in the branch, it happens online. And then the third party is, of course, that's actually not you, and somebody is actually impersonating you and defrauding you. So banks categorize different types of fraud by third party and first party as well, just as a high level definition in terms of getting into the thought process. That's just important to keep in mind. Fraud is increasingly becoming a critical factor. And why is that? Most importantly, as you've seen over the last several years, I would say, the more we are becoming digital, the more we are becoming more sophisticated in terms of how we live, how we make our payments, the more it's important for you as a customer to have a good experience. And hence, as a consequence, the more it's important for the bank to manage the fraud better. And that in itself is a challenge. It's a fine balance that you have to, I would say, keep in mind every day as a fraud manager or anyone who's playing any kind of role in a fraud function within a bank or financial institution. And I will get into that a little bit more further down into the presentation. And that's essentially why fraud plays a very important role for you as a customer to consider when you're actually going to a bank to open an account and become a customer. So that's that. Now, what do I mean by fraud as a balancing act? Now, if you think about it, we have millions of transactions every day, guys. Either it is online or it is the in the ATM, or you go and deposit a check in the branch, or you deposit a check on the cell phone. Of those millions of transactions, maybe a few 100,000 transactions, or maybe just 1,000, depending upon the product, depending upon the channel, are actually fraud. So the trick here is really about finding a needle in a haystack. And that's the challenge that fraud plays and faces every day. So you really have to balance how are you going to find those transactions that are actually fraud, while making sure that your customers are not getting defrauded so many times, or your customers don't face auto blocks way more than they should, and their experience is really negative, and they just leave the bank because, you know what, like if my card gets blocked 3 times out of 10 times I swipe it, I'm not interested to be the customer, right? And that's bad fraud management. So that's what I mean by why fraud is a balancing act. And there's a lot of things to dig into that, depending upon the kind of product you talk about, the channel you talk about, and we will get into that a little bit further down the road. So moving on, now I want to just quickly touch base on what I mean by fraud value chain. But before getting into that, I want to just quickly talk about what a payment life cycle is. And as you guys would have experienced on a daily basis, intuitively, there are essentially 5 steps here. And that's important to understand and keep in mind before you really understand what fraud does from a life cycle standpoint. The first stage is exactly the point where, let's say, your card information is stolen. Let's say somebody steals it either online or buys it off the deep net. The stage two is they take that information and they, let's say, go to Amazon and they buy something by impersonating you as a customer. The third step is the merchant or Amazon, whoever is looking at that transaction says, okay, yeah, that looks legitimate, and they authorize that transaction. And once that transaction is authorized, the fourth step is basically when you see that charge on your statement and you say, okay, that's not me, you call the bank in and you say, hey, can I get my money back? There's a fraud on my card. Then the bank goes to the merchant, and then the merchant gets hit by a chargeback and a fee. So that's the triage that happens. So that's the last and the fifth step in a payment life cycle. There's a lot that goes on in between each of these steps, and fraud as a function then comes and plays a role between each of these steps, and that's why it was important for me to go through this. Now let's just quickly understand a little bit about what the fraud value chain is or life cycle is. And there are really simply three main buckets within fraud. The first is the strategy team, the second is the detections team, and the last one is the claims team. And I think I speak perhaps for most of the banks in terms of their structure. Obviously, it can differ, and there is some malleability in terms of how organizations or banks structure their teams to best manage their fraud or their other risks. But essentially, there are these three buckets or teams. The strategy team is sort of like our the second line of defense, and I'll get into why it is a second line of defense in a little bit. So what is our function of a strategy team essentially? The core role here is, guys, that we create rules based on understanding what are the spending patterns of the customers, customer segmentation, looking at the fraud trends that are going on in the market right now, and some other things which essentially are more of a creative aspect within the function. So looking at as many variables as you can, you create these rules. And what happens is that these rules then get deployed and they interact with transactions on a real-time and a near real-time basis. Now, if you would have actually ever, and I believe everyone has, tapped somewhere at any merchant or a grocery shop or swiped, it takes about 1.8 seconds for that transaction to go through. And in that 1.8 seconds, there is a ton of information that gets exchanged and authorized between the bank and the merchant about you. And what basically happens at the time is, the transaction is either approved or not approved. A good example of this is, for example, if I have never gone into Cuba to purchase a $5,000 necklace, and I do that tomorrow, my transaction is gonna get blocked because that's not my behavior. So that's what the strategy team does. That's its core function. Now, what is the consequence of these rules is they basically create or flag transactions, which based on these rules, or I would say based on our assumptions, are fraudulent. Now, not necessarily true. There are false positives there. There are actually, so sometimes I would say depending upon the channel or the product, the false positives differ. So sometimes that's how you understand how good the rule is and how it has performed in the past and whether it should be updated or revised or just thrown out of the bucket. Now, since these rules are flagging the transactions, they're basically creating a queue, right, on a daily basis. Now, that's the core strategy team function. Then we move on to the detections team. Now, what the detection team does is that it takes a look at all those cases that were flagged by the rules, which were built by the strategy team. And what they do is they bucket them into high, medium, and low risk, right? Now, then they come in and they work those cases. And what do I mean by working those cases? They basically look at, what the history of the customer is and what really happened. and is it actually fraud or not? You know, so sometimes the strategies don't necessarily flag the right transaction. So that's the core function of the detections team. Now, once they've determined like what are those transactions that are actually fraud, and they need to flow into further down the value chain, then claims team comes into picture. So what do? They essentially look at all these transactions that were confirmed fraud, and they do the triage, they do the adjudication, and they do the recoveries. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, this means that looking at that transaction that was confirmed as fraud, doing the further investigation that is required to understand who needs to be paid back and who owes some money, and if TD is getting sort of like the money back, then how do we get it? How much do we get it? What's that percentage spread? And things like that. And then also we are responsible for recovering that money, right? So in that sense, out of these three buckets, claims team is a net contributor to the P&L of the bank, if you look at it that way from an expense standpoint. That's essentially the fraud value chain that goes hand in hand with a payment life cycle. And this is happening proactively, guys, like on a daily basis. These transactions are getting flagged, they're getting worked by the detections team, and they're getting flown into the buckets of the claims team, where they look at it and they resolve and they get the recoveries for the bank. All right, so that was something that I thought was necessary to sort of like understanding the fraud management in a banking and a financial service industry. Now, I just want to quickly get into what are sort of like the key skills. I think I've already spoken about this. I just want to get into what are the career opportunities and some of the key skills that you would need to find success in fraud management. All right, so let's go bucket by bucket. I want to segregate this into two buckets. First is strategy/analytics. That is sort of like the second line of defense, and the second bucket, which is the detection and the claims bucket. And the reason why I have segregated them in these two buckets is because the nature of the work here primarily is different because of one main idea. The first bucket is very strategic, very analytical. The second bucket is more operational and process oriented. So the nature of the work differs to a great extent, but certainly there are overlaps in terms of the skills that you will need to work in either of these two areas and still create a successful career. Now, before I get into this, I think I missed a point, and I want to talk about why strategy is the second line of defense. So the reason why strategy is the second line of defense, guys, is because the product itself, the credit card, for example, or the debit card, is the actual first line of defense. And why do I say that? It's because the way the product is designed, when it's being designed, it's kept in mind that the fraud is going to happen. So how do we make sure that the design incorporates the correct protocols, right? So what do I mean by that? So for example, if you compare US and Canada, Canada has pretty much covered the entire ground in terms of having our cards on chip and pin. That's not the case in the US. What is the purpose of chip and pin really? It's only to stop the fraud. There is no other purpose. So once you take that into account, that is really the first line of defense. So once that is kind of circumvented by the fraudster, then comes the strategy piece, which is the second line of defense, which is, well, the card was swiped, the attempt was made. Can we now, depending upon what the history of the customer is, the behavior is, fraud trends are, customer segmentation, the demographics, et cetera, flag the right fraud transaction? You know, that's why I call it as second line of defense. All right, perfect. So once that is out of the way, just let's get into the key skills that you would need. So within the strategy team, guys, I think I've listed down 5 in each of the buckets. which, according to me and my experience, were the most important skills that were necessary to really differentiate yourself and feel comfortable in the position, in the culture, in the atmosphere of fraud. Number one, I would say here is problem solving, and really what I mean by problem solving is, like I mentioned earlier, fraud is always evolving. So the trend that you might see today, you might not see, tomorrow or the next week. So you really have to be comfortable with the idea that can you come into work every day thinking you might not get to do what you really thought you would do, and you have other things to take care of because there's a hole in one of the areas that you have to plug and needs your attention right away. Um, and how do you deal with that? And this is a good segue for me to talk about ambiguity and white space, which is the second point here, simply because it's very much correlated. So one thing I found out very early into my tenure here was, as opposed to being in finance, being in fraud was very much white space experience. And what do I mean by that is the kind of problems you're solving, they have never been dealt with before. So there is really no rule, or there is no sort of a perfect written down scripture that this is what you should do or follow. So there is a lot of assumptions. There is a lot of uh, ambiguity that you have to get comfortable with and come up with. Let's say you have to make certain assumptions for a business case for a product or a technology that has never been launched before, and it requires a certain amount of investment, and you're prepping the business case to put it in front of, let's say, one of the SVPs, and you need to make certain assumptions about how much fraud can you expect once the technology gets deployed. Um, Never been done before. Are you comfortable with making reasonable assumptions on that and back it up with good data? That's what I mean by the second point. And some people can be very comfortable in that position, some might not be. I think, personally speaking, it's very important to kind of connect the dots between these key skills and your temperaments before you go further along into a area or a job, whichever that job is, not just fraud. Um, and and neither is good or bad. I think it's just a personal preference. When you really understand your sweet spot, you can really thrive, right? The third thing I would say is the communication. Uh, this is important simply because you can be the best of the analyst. You can um, you can do the best of coding work, and you can be a coding monkey, but if you really cannot articulate the analytics into a story and communicate that to people who do not have a very analytics heavy background as you guys, um, that can only take you so far. So I think it's a bit of a learned skill as well, um, that comes along. But before you get into this kind of environment, I think it's important to recognize it at the door and address it to really kind of differentiate yourself from day one. The fourth, I would say, is data management skills. Pretty obvious when you're dealing with humongous amounts of data. You really need to be good with some of these management tools, SQL, Python, R, SAS, Tableau. Um, in my personal opinion, I don't necessarily give too much importance to the tools as much as I think what's important is to really understand the applications or how you're going to manipulate the data and the objective of it. Um, Knowing how to work the tools comes after that. Um, Simply because I speak with experience and even observation around me, I think in some of the most successful analysts in fraud um, have an incredible sense of understanding about the business and how payments work. And once you understand how payments work, it's really a mirror image where fraud occurs. So um, that's really important for me, and I think that is true for most of us to find success. Um, and yes, obviously these are great tools to have because pretty much most of the work that gets done within our space is done either on some of these tools or Excel. Um, but yes, these tools are probably the ones that are most important. The last thing I would say here is the ability to work with cross-functional teams. And the reason why I say this is because to be a successful player in fraud, you really cannot work in silos. And why do I say that? It's because let's say you work in a strategy team and you're responsible for, let's say, debit cards. So your team is monitoring debit cards on a daily basis, and it's generating, let's say, 100 alerts. And what do I mean by alerts? It's flagging 100 transactions a day, hypothetically speaking. But if there isn't the capacity in the bank to actually look at those 100 alerts and investigate them, it's not going to do you any good. So it really is very important for fraud and all the three buckets within fraud to work in tandem, in hand to hand, so that what strategy is doing or is planning to do is backed up with the operational capacity and objective that all the leadership across the value chain shares. So that's those are the 5 key skills I would say are the most necessary ones to find success in strategy. Moving on to the detections of the claims piece, I guess I would say there is some overlap as far as problem solving and communication goes, but some of the most differentiating key skills here would be people management. So there is a heavy focus here because it's a very operational heavy. You're leading a team, of agents who are perhaps sometimes a team of 20 or sometimes a team of 50 agents even. So how do you manage them? How do you coach them? How do you motivate them? How do you strive your team to gain more and more solid knowledge of the business and have an investigative mind? So that's, I think, another important skill. I think when you are investigating all these different cases that are happening on a daily basis as a consequence of fraudsters doing their job more creatively ever so often, you always have to have that investigative mindset as to what really happened here. And sometimes it can get a little more complicated because I can tell you guys, like some of the fraudsters, they're super creative, and it's not really obvious, but once you go down the road of understanding and looking at some of these transactions or some of these strategies that are being used, there certainly are an entertainment for sure. The second thing I would say, I guess, and probably the last one I would say, is the continuous improvement and sort of like the operational excellence that you have to keep in mind, because you're very, when you're in that space, you're very operational. You're very your main job is to make sure that you're looking at the processes, you're looking at the procedures, and you're trying to make sure how I can make that better. How I can, for example, if my team is working 100 alerts, 100 transactions, investigating 100 transactions in a day, how can I make it better in the sense that, for example, let me see how many high risk alerts am I working, how many medium risk. Now there are ways to look at it in a way that, well, you might be working more complicated cases, but you might not be working high value cases. So there is always plenty of metrics or plenty of room for operational improvement and excellence that you always have to strive for. And that's probably one of the other key skills in detections and claims that is needed. So if that is one of the things that you always feel like you're good at, then that could perhaps be the right space for you. With that, I think I've kind of shared everything I wanted to. So thank you guys. And I'm going to pause here and pass it over to Zoe and Lewan. Over to you guys.
Okay. Thank you so much, Gurpreet. That was awesome. I think I definitely learned a lot from your presentation. Hope everyone else has also learned something. So for the next part of our event, we'll just do some of the questions and answers. So don't forget to post your questions to our Slido pages, so we can see them and answer them. So before we go to here, I'll just first look at the questions people send when they fill in the form. All right, so let's start with the first one.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think like couple things that our audience
I was expecting
like,
that.
yeah, they cares the most is like how to get jobs, and also like how does pandemic affects like different industries, right? So, and also I'm gonna kindly ask you to give short answers on these questions, because I do see there are like actually many questions getting asked in our Slido pages.
Really?
So we'll just keep like the question and answers a bit shorter. So yeah,
Sure,
may you share your like insights on this one?
For sure. So I think the answer is yes. There is no other way around here, guys. I'd say the three key areas where fraud has really changed in terms or shifted in terms of its trends as far as pandemic is concerned, right? For about March or April this year, we had about almost on the personal banking side, and what I mean that personal banking is debit cards and credit cards primarily. So when you talk about channels, and I think I spoke about channels as you know the key things in fraud a couple of times. Channels essentially, guys, is the point of sale or the way the transaction occurs. So two key buckets where how you can differentiate channels is card present and card not present. Very intuitively, card present is when the card is actually present. So you go in a shop and physically tap or swipe or insert and do the chip and pin. Or card not present is, let's say, when you do an online transaction on an Amazon or something. So what we've actually observed is right from March and April, we had about a 50% shift upwards in our card not present transactions. And it's very obvious, guys. People were not going out; they were buying things online. So that shift was pretty obvious, and it still continues. We are starting to see a little bit of a taper in there. But with the second wave coming, I think it's still kind of going to continue in that 50% uptick range for the next few months, as far as the second wave kind of tapers down a little bit. The second thing I would say here is that digital transactions have actually also skyrocketed. So when you transfer money, I'm not talking about Interact, but when you talk wire transfers or other kind of sort of transactions that you do online, we saw roughly 30 to 50% uptick in that as well. And that's second. The third thing I would say is what's actually gone down is fraud in a branch. So very obviously, people have no opportunity or very little to no opportunity to actually make physical fraud these days. And I'm not saying it's zero, but in the branch, it's relatively very, very low compared to what it used to be. So those are the three things I would say has changed after pandemic.
Okay, cool. I think that's those make sense, right? Like because of pandemic, now we're all at home and all we can do is just like online shopping, I guess. Yeah, so the second question, what do you think is the major challenge in current fraud detection process in the industry?
That's a great question. So I think I would say what makes fraud special or unique is also it's one of the biggest challenges. And what do I mean by that? I think I touched upon this a little bit. So fraud is really about finding a needle in the haystack, and that's what I always say. So one of the key challenges here is, well, figure out what the acceptable level of loss is in general, while keeping or making sure that they are still the best product out there. So, and that's the fine balance, and that in itself is probably the biggest challenge that every bank or a financial institution faces. Then I think a little bit connected to that, the second thing I would say is that since fraud trends change all the time, that in itself creates a challenge because you always have to think about how do I create rules which are which require the least amount of human intervention and still do the job that I wanted to do, um, and be able to put many different hats, and make sure that I keep plugging the holes. And that's another problem, guys, because fraudsters are unfortunately one step ahead of us, more often than not. So what they're trying to do is play catch, and every time you introduce a new technology, it obviously solves a problem, but potentially it can create more problems because it's only a matter of time before fraudsters really figure out how to circumvent that strategy. So, sorry, the technology. So for example, chip and pin is really a good example because it hasn't yet been massively figured out by the fraudsters to how to crack the chip and pin. So it's really working for us at this point, but in my opinion, it's only a matter of time, right? So how do we make sure that we close the gap between these two things? So those are the two key challenges I think everyone faces within the fraud industry.
Thanks for your answer. I was just thinking, yeah, it must be very hard because like if we do consulting works, we can talk with our clients directly. But for you guys, I'm imagining it would be pretty hard to talk directly to the fraudsters and ask like, say, what kind of technologies are you guys planning to use tomorrow? Like, if you guys can do that, that might make things a bit easier. Yeah. Anyways,
yeah,
all right.
Correct.
So the third question, I'm doing 1 year insurance management program at Centennial. We used to do investigation of fraudulent cases of checks. So is it the same work? Like what we'll be doing, like if they got hired, like in banks or not?
Pretty much the same thing. I would say similar lines. Investigation in itself and a fundamental meaning is still investigation. But the differentiator would be where the person, the individual sits within that fraud value chain. So if you are in the strategy team, you would potentially be working on writing rules and deploying them that are going to, like I said, they're going to, excuse me, figure out if the transaction is fraud or not, or the check is fraud or not, and there are technologies or platforms that we do that with. As opposed to if you're sitting in a detections team, then you're actually looking at the transaction and saying, hey, wait, so let's just look at like really what happened here. Let me just actually understand what the physical features of the checks are. Does it actually check out all the balances and controls that I have in place, and things like that? So yes, the answer is more yes than it is no, but it really depends upon where the person sits in the team.
Sounds good. Last one is a long question. I would not read it up. Just read it silently.
Okay, so I'll do it for you. Interesting to hear how machine learning is applied for fraud detection. So yes, we rely heavily on machine learning. Not so much on AI, but machine learning is essentially massively used simply because these rules are created based on that idea. Like I said before. So the answer here is yes. Long story short, algorithms need to be developed constantly as different fraud schemes vary across industries. That's absolutely correct. So you always have to keep updating the rules depending upon how things have changed. Some of the things are beyond our control. So for example, changes in regulations or changes in, I see that, there you go. So let's say changes in like let's say rules by Visa, or even the bank itself, sometimes can impact how the rules need to be shifted or changed. Now, how do we do that? Obviously, there is a process in place to make sure that whatever changes we are making to the variables in the model are reviewed and checked by the team that is actually the owner of the tool that the fraud is detected upon, and B, it is reviewed by the management and the team itself. Now there are reviews. These two different reviews, they solve very different purpose. The review with the product owner is basically to make sure that the code is working fine. It isn't taking like 20 minutes, whereas it should have been taking only 5 minutes. The review with the manager or the team itself is basically to make sure that it is doing what it is supposed to. So if the objective was, let's say, to do X, it is doing X. It's not doing X plus 1 or X plus 2. Just very high level, I would say that's the difference. So that process is monitored and adhered to every time any new rule is actually deployed, or if there are any changes that are made to the existing rules. So that's the answer. What are some of the challenges? I think I just spoke about that. What else? I think that's
Yes.
so.
I have a question to just add on top here. So how much explainability does the rule needs to have? Like when you create a rule, do you need to like clearly explain like how does this rule work in different kind of like scenarios, or
Correct.
just like it improves the accuracy by 0.5%, that's enough?
Correct. So that's a great question. So I think what really matters here is before any rule is deployed, right, there has to be a back testing. So what I mean by that is, simply put, let's imagine you take the last 3 months worth of data. Okay. Now, let's say there are 100 transactions in the last 3 months, hypothetically, and off of that, 8 were actually fraud. Okay. And of those 8, 20 were actually attempted, but 8 were only fraud, the actual fraud. That's the sample size that we have to make sure that happens, that comes out. So what we are going to do here is going to take not that 100, but just 80 of those transactions. And we're going to test the model on that 80 transactions and see what we get, okay? The results that we get, we're going to replicate it on the next 20. And if they're similar, and if it's doing what it's supposed to, then it's sort of a green light. Obviously, there are some other factors that you have to consider, but there is always a sort of call it a back testing, for lack of a better word, that goes on to test whether the rule does what it's supposed to, and then it actually goes live.
I see. Cool. All right, that's pretty cool. And also, yeah, that kind of like ends on all the questions that we prepared ahead. So everything else was asked like during the event. I'm gonna make this page slightly bigger. If I think the questions already got covered like during the presentation, I may just like skip through it. So please forgive me for doing that. So, okay, first one, 8 upvotes. What kind of opportunities does machine learning techniques see through the deep learning? I guess, yeah, the inferencing speed might be a problem, but yeah, Gurpreet, any thoughts on that one?
I would say like what I just kind of shared is where we are right now. But obviously, end state is to keep improving upon what we do and have more dynamic strategies versus have more static strategies. As much as possible, reduce the human intervention possible. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. So next question: what level of finance knowledge or experience do analyst job require in banks? I guess, yeah. If there are any certificates that you would recommend, please just like name drop a few.
Right. Okay. So I think as far as finance is concerned, you can always consider a CPA or a CFA designation, just to get the domain knowledge specifically. And I would say as far as fraud is concerned, there is a exam. I think it's called CFE or something to that end. I don't exactly remember the accreditation, but there is a specific fraud exam that you can take to get sort of an edge over the other as far as the domain knowledge is concerned. The other one thing I think I give a lot of importance to is a solid knowledge of the products and what the business is as far as bank is concerned, if you're really trying to apply there. Because I think that really sets you apart in terms of accelerating your learning curve and differentiating yourself. It's easier said than done, of course, because When you get into a bank, obviously every bank or a financial institution will have a different suite of products and services, and the way they're structured is different. But fundamentally, if you can understand how a bank works, what kind of services and products it offers, basically it's not that difficult to grasp the idea. We borrow money, we lend money, we earn the interest spread, essentially. Um, that that is really helpful in my opinion. So that would be like the third thing I would say is very important.
Okay, cool. So I guess I just want to ask another question on top of this one as well. How friendly is like say a fraud analyst job like towards like say new grads? Like is it like easy to get into, or is it like a bit hard that you need to study for a long time for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as you can demonstrate in the interview that you have a good understanding of how the bank works and kind of products and services it offers, um, show a bit of an inquisitive bent of mind towards what fraud really is, and and the last thing would be just have some database management skills. So that will definitely set you apart in terms of an interview for one of the roles in fraud strategy team.
Sounds good. Okay, SQL and Python again, guys. All right, so next question is someone with an engineering background, specifically industrial engineering, eligible for analytics or fraud management role in a bank? Maybe short answer, yes?
I think my answer, yeah, I think I kind of answered it. We have people from very different backgrounds. What does really matter is essentially your interest in the role, and the ability for you to actually put in the effort. I don't personally, and I haven't personally in the past given too much importance to background as much as I've given, to how the person actually comes across and shows initiative. I think that is a very, very important thing. Fraud isn't a rocket science, guys. It still is within the business bucket. You're in the corporate world. And I don't think you need IQ more than 120 to succeed in business. So as far as you're able to put your effort in and you're able to show initiative, you should be good.
Sounds good. Next question is, Gurpreet, is there a team within the bank that deals with accounting fraud?
I believe there is, yes, but that doesn't sit close to us, or that doesn't really have much to do with what we do. So my apologies, I'm not able to actually shed more light on that question.
Okay, cool, that's totally okay. Next question, are global static rules that the strategy team set, or do they change dynamically depending on the user? What kind of technology does the company use? Ooh, are you allowed to talk about that, or it's okay?
Not really. But I would say in general, it's a mix. We are more static, I think, as an industry than we are dynamic, and that is the end state, to get to the point where we deploy more AI. But there is a scalability problem there, which is one of the key issues. Acting as a bottleneck. The technology I'm not supposed to actually say, so I'm sorry there.
Yeah, totally understandable. I think one thing, a couple sentences I want to add is there is a theorem called no free lunch theorem. So basically it states the more customized you do for one person, you may sacrifice the performance on the general public or the general audience. So I guess in general, we need to keep things general high level, but then maybe a little bit customization can be done. And next question, how and why?
In my opinion,
sorry, go ahead.
No, just one last point I would like to add is, because that's a really good question. One of the things that's kind of an industry problem, I would say, is as far as sort of dynamic rules or self-learning rules or AI is the monitoring and observation, or kind of the oversight of it. Simply because when you deploy a rule that can change by itself, if you do not have a live 24/7 monitoring or oversight on it, and let's say one or two of the variables, they go in a separate direction, it can really piss off a lot of customers. So and that's essentially, I think, the biggest problem. And once that is resolved, I think you will see a massive, massive revolution in the industry.
Yeah.
And we can move on now.
Sounds good. We're close to 8. We may just like extend for 5 more minutes, but like, thank you so much for everyone for your time tonight. And I really, really appreciate everyone who opens up your camera. I think this event is so far that we have the most of people open up cameras. So thank you guys so much. You guys are the best.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so we'll just move on to the next question. I am a financial service student. Can you please suggest what kinds of skills and certifications? I think we have like touched on this. The skill sets were listed in the slides, and then some designations, CPA, CFA, and the other ones mentioned in the chat might be helpful. Does your work involve long-form text or NLP? If so, do you focus on linguistic patterns or content in predicting fraud? Oh, NLP.
That is a great question. That's a great question. So we fraud strategy doesn't, and the reason why we don't is because there is a separate arm in the business that's called phone channel. And just by the name, guys, you can understand it basically means that they deal with the fraud that occurs when the customer calls into the bank. Okay. And anything voice related is basically their job. But what I can tell you is that it's also already a public news or rather a technology that's already been implemented is voice print. So if one of you is a TD customer, you would have basically either come across or you will in the future come across this thing called as voice print. What that does is essentially, you call in and you say, yeah, I want to register for voice print, and they take, using, I think, the NLP technology, they take your print of your voice, and then anytime in the future you want to call into the bank, you don't have to authenticate yourself. They would self-authenticate by the voice that you have, which is unique, right? So that's already implemented. So that's a great question.
Voice print, that sounds pretty cool. I work in the NLP data science field. I think there is something happening, but not particularly on the long form text. We do some like name consolidation, like say, Tom use a fake identities using something else, Tommy, I guess. That would be relatively easier to find out, but yeah, I don't think there's too much happening on the long form text or NLP. Next one, big banks like TD Bank, Scotia offer co-op to some students. Can you please help us elaborate the work students need to do in co-op?
Correct, that's a good question. So yes, we do take co-ops, usually during the summertime. The kind of work they do is essentially, again, depending upon the team that they sit in. As far as strategy team is concerned, they can be doing anything from sort of like an operational work. What I mean by operational work within the strategy team is that they could be helping us write the rules or doing some sort of analysis on the data, very, very data heavy kind of environment. Or they could be doing some project work. So there are these transformational projects that are being worked on, and they are responsible for basically coming in and improving the way we already try to catch fraud. So either of these two, I would say, to generally get an idea, a co-op student can be sitting in and doing that type of work.
Sounds good. Next question, what is the best way for a graduate student to get an internship in banks such as TD? That's a pretty good question.
That's a good question, yes. So I think, like I said earlier, we open up for internships in the summer, usually. So there are, the applications, they go online. So that is a great way to actually just get the application in, get the step into the door. And then I would say the other thing is to network. That is something that has always been taught to us, always has worked for people like me and people like who are around me, and I've seen that work time and time again. So I always encourage people to network and keep in touch with professionals that you essentially are aspiring a career similar to. And I would say, yeah, that's the way to go.
Cool. Next question, what is the working culture in TD looks like? I guess the question would be more like, do you need to work overtime? And please be honest.
So yes, I mean, I would say it really depends, to be honest with you. Overall, I have actually been very happy with the culture. it's very inclusive and it's very diverse. And there are plenty of initiatives and events happening that you can participate in and grow your network just within the bank like that. Culturally, I think it's just in terms of how the culture flows from the top down. I am pretty satisfied and very, very happy with it. So yeah, like personally, my experience has been great. I encourage everyone to consider TD as their career option.
Sounds good. I think some questions moved up, but sort of gone. All right, so the next one, please share your experiences. Like, did you undergo some trainings or take certificates? I guess, is your LinkedIn profile up to date? Can people go there and understand like what you have done in the past? How does TD recruitment be? I guess. Yeah.
So that's a good question, actually. So usually when we hire from, let's say, from the ground up, so let's say when we hire analysts or associates, like I said, some of the skills and data management tools that we look for in a person are standard. Usually there could be 2 or 3 rounds. One would definitely be the HR round in the beginning. The second would be sort of with the team itself. Now, depending upon the team, some might have a case interview, some might not, depending upon the work and the profile you're applying for. Once the second interview, which is probably the most important one, is through, the third interview would most likely be sort of like a conversational, sort of a like a fit interview, just getting to know the team and things like that. So that's usually the case that I've noticed and we followed in the past.
Sounds good. And this will be the last question for today. Sorry, I'm gonna skip one because I'm from Alberta, so I have to ask this one. Are there opportunities outside of Toronto?
Correct. So that's a good question. Yes, we fraud as a practice, we serve the entire bank. So which means we serve all the lines of businesses. And there is a small segment of the team that sits in Ottawa. So as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, there are opportunities in Ottawa as well.
I see. If everyone is starting to working from home, do you see this like start to have like these like location restrictions for the positions, or you think still like only consider candidates who physically live in like Toronto or Ottawa?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, like I think it really just kind of touches to the point where how and when are we going to go back, because there are certain roles within fraud that you can do offline. Sort of what I mean by offline is not in the location, and there are certain roles that you preferably the bank wants you to go in and actually work on. What do I mean by that? So for example, if you are in strategy team and if you're just simply writing rules and monitoring the losses on a daily basis, you can perhaps do it from home. So that's an option. The other sort of the operational areas where you have a team of, let's say, 20 agents who are taking calls, right? For example, or investigating cases. They probably can work from home, but they might be better off working from the office, right? And there are certain implications to that. One of them, I think, that comes to my mind is data privacy. So for example, if an agent or somebody in the fraud team is working, let's say from a cafe, right? Somebody who's like sitting behind that person can actually see the data. And there is a little bit of an oversight on this because there is a lot of sensitivity to the data that we have access to, and hence we have to be a little more careful. So there you go.
Yeah, totally makes sense. All right, so that just wraps up like today's event. I had lots of fun from today's event.
Same here. That's such a great question here. Like I'm so happy to see the interest and the effort people have put in. I'm so happy. Thank you, guys.
Glad that you enjoyed as well. So for everyone who is still here, feel free to connect to Gurpreet on LinkedIn. and also as well as myself and Zoe. We're looking forward to hearing more from you, and we may send out a quick survey because we are also brainstorming on the new ideas that we want to host for future events. So if you can shed like some lights on like what kind of events do you think might be helpful or you'd be interested to attend, that would be greatly appreciated. Have a good night, everyone, and thank you for your time again.
Have a good night, guys.
Thanks, Gurpreet.
Have a good long weekend. Bye.
Bye.